The metallic stench of wet pennies always means someone is emptying out.
Ma'am, keep going.
When the
We're
stranger
securing the
crashed
area.
against the diner's
What
pie
happened here?
case,
Was
clutching
there
a
shooting?
torn neck
I
artery,
need an AED,
Naomi
get the
didn't
paramedics.
flinch. She dropped her coffee, jammed 2 bare fingers deep behind his collarbone to pin the vessel, and silently began to count the seconds. Neon buzzed a steady, irritating B-flat outside the grease-stained window of Mel's diner. Naomi sat in the corner booth, rubbing her thumb over the raised lettering of her plastic hospital ID badge. 14 hours in the ER triage pit left a person hollowed out. She smelled like cheap hand sanitizer, stale sweat, and the distinct metallic tang of other people's bad luck. Her feet throbbed inside her worn-out sneakers. All she wanted was a plate of hash browns and the quiet hum of the 2 a.m. graveyard shift. Then the bells above the door chimed, a cheerful, violent contrast to the man who staggered through the frame. He didn't walk, he listed, a heavy-set man in a dark rain jacket clutching the right side of his neck. Rainwater dripped from his boots, but the puddle forming around his feet wasn't clear. It was black in the dim light, viscous. Naomi didn't move immediately. Her brain, sluggish with exhaustion, tried to categorize him, drunk, mugging victim. But then he coughed, a wet, rattling sound that bypassed her conscious mind and tripped a wire deep in her brainstem. He pitched forward, taking a bar stool down with him. The crash was deafening. The lone waitress, a teenager named Chloe, dropped a ceramic mug. It shattered. Naomi was out of her booth before she made the decision to stand. "Call 911, Naomi snapped, her voice devoid of any bedside manner. It was a flat, abrasive bark. She slid to her knees beside him. The linoleum was already slick. The man was convulsing, his hands weakly pulling at his collar. Naomi shoved his hands away. They were massive, calloused, and fought back with a sudden delirious strength. He groaned, a feral sound, and tried to swing a heavy fist at her face. Combat reflex, Naomi thought automatically. He thinks he's still in the fight. "Hold still, you idiot," she muttered, dodging the wild swing. She slammed her forearm down across his sternum, pinning him with her body weight. She ripped his jacket open. The wound wasn't pretty. It wasn't a clean knife slice. It looked like a jagged tear tearing through the trapezius and diving deep toward the chest cavity.
An arterial spray hit her cheek, warm, sticky, the subclavian artery. It was tucked deep behind the collarbone, feeding the arm, bleeding out at a catastrophic rate. If she just pressed a towel to it, he'd be dead before the dispatcher even answered the phone. Direct pressure wouldn't work. The bone was in the way. "I need towels," Chloe shrieked from the counter. "Too late," Naomi grunted. She had to clamp the artery against the first rib. Blind, Naomi shoved 2 fingers into the torn meat of his shoulder, ignoring the slick, warm slide of tissue and fat. She dug deep, hooking behind the clavicle. The man roared, a roar, agonizing sound of pure pain, and bucked beneath her. "Stay down." Naomi threw her left knee onto his uninjured shoulder, grinding her weight into him to keep him flat. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't healing. It was brutal, mechanical leverage. Her fingers found the pulse point. She pressed down with everything she had, grinding the severed vessel against the hard ridge of the rib, the bleeding slowed to a sluggish ooze. "Okay," Naomi breathed, a drop of sweat stinging her eye. "Okay, I got it." But her hand was already cramping. The human hand isn't designed to hold that much localized pressure for long. Her knuckles screamed. She looked at the diner clock above the grill, 2:14 a.m. The man stared up at her, his eyes, previously wild and unfocused, suddenly sharpened. The delirium broke for a fraction of a second. They were cold blue, taking in her face, the angle of her arm, the precise, unyielding pressure of her fingers. "Ooh," he croaked, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Shut up," Naomi said. She didn't offer a reassuring smile. She didn't tell him he was going to be fine. She just watched the clock. The second hand swept past the 12. 1 minute. Her forearm burned. She shifted her weight, maintaining the death grip. The man's skin was turning the color of wet ash. His breathing was shallow. "Chloe," Naomi said, her voice strained. "Where is the ambulance?" "They said 4 minutes," Chloe sobbed, standing 3 feet away, terrified to come closer. 2 minutes. Naomi's fingers went numb. The slickness of the blood made it a constant agonizing battle to maintain the pinch. If she slipped by a millimeter, the pressure would release, and he would empty out onto the floor in 30 seconds. He tried to swallow. "Cole," he whispered. "Name's Cole. Don't care. Cole, conserve your oxygen," Naomi replied. Her knees ached against the hard floor.
The smell of the blood was overpowering now, masking the scent of the diner's old frying oil. It was entirely too intimate, kneeling over a dying man, her hands buried inside his chest. 3 minutes. Her wrist started to shake. "Come on. Hold it. Lock the elbow. Lock the damn elbow."
She leaned entirely on that one arm, turning herself into a human tourniquet. She felt the heavy thudding vibration of his heart fighting to keep pumping through the pinched artery. It felt like holding a live wire. Sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the drumming rain. 4 minutes. The diner doors burst open, paramedics spilled in, dragging heavy bags. They froze for a half-second, taking in the scene, the blood-soaked floor, the shattered mug, and the exhausted woman practically sitting on the victim, her hand buried up to the knuckles in his shoulder. Subclavian tear, Naomi stated, her voice tight, devoid of emotion. I have it clamped against the first rib. I need a heis. I can't hold it much longer. The lead medic blinked, breaking out of his stupor. He didn't question her. He tore open a pack, handing her the steel clamps. On 3, Naomi said. I release. You go in blind. Hook right. Ready? Ready. She pulled her hand out. The blood immediately surged, a red geyser, but the medic was fast. He clamped the vessel. The bleeding stopped. Naomi rocked back on her heels. She stared at her right hand. It was stained crimson, shaking violently, covered in a stranger's life. She didn't feel heroic. She just felt deeply, profoundly tired. Good job, nurse. The medic tossed over her shoulder as they loaded Cole onto the stretcher. Naomi wiped her bloody hand on her jeans, leaving a dark smear. She looked at her cold coffee on the counter. Yeah, she muttered. Great. Dried blood feels like a second skin. It tightens as it oxidizes, pulling at the tiny hairs on your arms, turning into an itchy brown crust. Naomi sat in the sterile interrogation room of the 4th precinct, picking at the rim of a styrofoam cup. The coffee inside tasted like burnt battery acid. It had been 3 hours. The local cops had taken a statement, looked at her scrubs and her ID, and patted her on the back. Right place, right time, they said. Lucky guy. They told her she was free to go. Then a pair of dark SUVs had rolled into the precinct parking lot, and suddenly she wasn't free to go anymore.
The heavy metal door clicked open. 2 men walked in. They didn't look like local detectives. They wore suits that fit tightly across the shoulders, and they carried the quiet, heavy arrogance of federal authority. They smelled faintly of dry cleaning fluid and expensive aftershave. The older one dropped a manila folder onto the metal table. It landed with a definitive smack. Naomi Harding, the man said. He didn't offer his hand. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. The younger agent leaned against the wall by the door, arms crossed. Am I under arrest? Naomi asked. Her voice was scratchy. She desperately wanted a cigarette, a habit she'd supposedly kicked 5 years ago. No, the sitting agent said. I'm Special Agent Briggs, FBI. This is Agent Hayes. We just want to clarify a few details about what happened at the diner. I told the beat cops everything, Naomi said, maintaining eye contact. She kept her face blank, relaxing her facial muscles. Show nothing. Give nothing. A guy walked in bleeding. I applied pressure. The ambulance came. Briggs smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. He opened the folder. Inside were high-resolution photographs taken at the hospital. The man you saved is named Cole Mitchell, Briggs said smoothly. He's alive. Barely. Surgery took 3 hours. The trauma surgeon was very impressed. Good for him, Naomi said, taking a sip of the terrible coffee. He was impressed, Briggs continued, leaning forward, because of the precision of the first aid. You see, Miss Harding, the local cops thought you just shoved a towel into his neck, but the surgeon found severe bruising on Mitchell's sternum and a hairline fracture on his clavicle. Naomi's pulse ticked up just a fraction. She kept her breathing slow. I had to use force, Naomi said. He was combative. Shock. Right, shock, Briggs nodded. But to stop a subclavian bleed without tools, you didn't just apply pressure. You executed a blind digital clamp. You bypassed the superficial wound, jammed your fingers in, and pinned the artery against the first rib. Do you know how much anatomical knowledge and raw hand strength that takes? I'm an ER nurse. We see trauma. The younger agent, Hayes, scoffed from the wall. You're a pediatric nurse at St. Jude's, Miss Harding. You hand out lollipops and set broken wrists. Before that, you were an admissions clerk in Seattle.
Briggs tapped the file. Mitchell isn't a civilian. He's a Navy SEAL attached to a highly classified task force. He was targeted tonight by professionals. Professionals who thought they killed him.
Yet he survives because a pediatric nurse happens to be eating hash browns at 2 a.m. and perfectly executes a tactical combat casualty care maneuver taught almost exclusively to Tier 1 operators. Silence stretched in the room. The fluorescent lights hummed above them, casting harsh greenish shadows over Naomi's face. She looked at her bloody hands. She should have just let him die. No, that wasn't true. She couldn't have done that. But God, the mess she had just stepped back into. I watch a lot of medical documentaries, Naomi said flatly. Briggs laughed, a short, humorless sound. That's good. That's very good. Let's try another one. Why does a pediatric nurse from Seattle have zero digital footprint before 2018? No tax records, no high school yearbook photos, no social media. Naomi leaned back in her chair. The exhaustion was vanishing, replaced by a cold, familiar hypervigilance. She noticed the slight bulge under Hayes' left arm, shoulder holster. She noted the distance from her chair to the door. 2 steps. Too far. Identity theft, Naomi lied smoothly. It was a whole thing. Had to rebuild my credit. If you want to run a background check, talk to my lawyer. We did run a background check, Hayes spoke up, pushing off the wall. Your fingerprints pinged a database at Quantico, a restricted database, the kind of database that requires a director's clearance just to open the file name. Briggs closed the folder. We don't know who you really are, Naomi, but we know what you are. And right now, the people who tried to kill Cole Mitchell are going to find out that someone in that diner knew exactly how to save him. Someone with tactical training. Naomi stared at the styrofoam cup. She squeezed it. The plastic cracked. Brown coffee seeping over her knuckles, mingling with the dried blood. If ye's a seal, Naomi said softly, her tone shifting entirely. The civilian hesitancy was gone. Her voice was dead calm, dropping an octave. Then he was followed. Which means your hitmen know he made it to the hospital, which means the hospital isn't secure. Briggs frowned, momentarily thrown off by the sudden change in her demeanor. We have agents at the ICU. Are they standard field agents or tactical?
Naomi cut him off, her eyes snapping up to meet his. Standard, but then they're already dead, Naomi said, standing up. The chair scraped loudly against the concrete floor. And if you want your boy Mitchell to survive the night, you need to get me out of this room right now. Tires chewed through the flooded asphalt, throwing heavy arcs of dirty water against the parked cars lining the route to Memorial Hospital. Inside the FBI Tahoe, the air was suffocating, thick with the smell of wet wool and Hayes' nervous sweat. Naomi sat in the back seat, her hands resting flat on her denim thighs. They were still stained brown around the cuticles. She stared at them, hating the familiar ice-cold stillness settling into her chest. She wasn't panicked. That was the worst part. She missed the panic. Panic meant you were normal. Panic meant you were a civilian whose brain didn't automatically start calculating angles of fire through the windshield or noting that Hayes hadn't chambered around in his Glock yet. Call your men, Naomi said. Her voice was a flat, abrasive rasp over the hum of the engine. Briggs navigated a hard right turn, his jaw clenched tight. I've been trying. They aren't picking up. Radio silence. Then they're dead, Naomi stated. It wasn't an accusation. It was a clinical assessment. Standard field agents sit outside the door. They drink coffee. They look at their phones. A tactical team doesn't engage them. A tactical team walks past them in scrubs with a suppressed pistol wrapped in a towel. They probably didn't even hear the footsteps. Hayes twisted in the passenger seat, his face pale under the passing streetlights. You don't know that. It's a crowded ICU. It's 3 a.m., Naomi corrected him. ICUs are ghost towns at this hour. Skeleton crew. Half the nurses are charting in the break room. The lights are dimmed to let the patient sleep. Briggs slammed the brakes. The Tahoe skidded to a halt in the red emergency loading zone, the tires shrieking against the wet concrete. Naomi was out the door before the vehicle fully rocked back on its suspension. The cold rain hit her face, a sharp, stinging contrast to the stifling car.
She bypassed the main trauma doors, cutting hard left toward the loading dock. Hey! Hayes yelled, struggling to unbuckle his seatbelt. Harding, stop! She didn't stop. She knew Memorial's layout. Every hospital had the same architectural flaws. The service elevators for bio-waste and laundry bypassed the front desk and opened directly into the sterile corridors. She hit the metal push bar of the service door, slipping inside. The smell hit her instantly, industrial bleach masking the faint, sour odor of illness and old linen.
It was a smell she usually found comforting. Tonight it smelled like an ambush. Briggs and Hayes pushed through the door a second later, their weapons drawn. The metallic clack of Hayes racking his slide echoed down the concrete hallway. "Put that away before you shoot a janitor," Naomi whispered harshly, stripping off her wet jacket and letting it drop to the floor. "Keep your weapons low. We take the stairs. 3rd floor, west wing." They climbed. The stairwell was dead silent, save for the heavy syncopated thud of their boots on the metal grating. Naomi's quads burned, a dull ache radiating from her previous marathon shift in the ER triage, but her breathing remained completely controlled. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. The tactical breathing was involuntary, a phantom reflex from a life she had spent 5 years trying to bury under pediatric charts and Disney-themed Band-Aids. They reached the 3rd floor landing. Naomi held up a fist. Briggs and Hayes stopped behind her. She pressed her ear against the heavy fire door. Nothing. Just the faint rhythmic beep of a cardiac monitor, echoing from somewhere down the hall. Naomi pushed the door open an inch. The corridor was bathed in the sickly yellow glow of emergency lighting. At the far end, outside room 312, 2 men in dark suits sat in plastic waiting chairs. Their heads were tipped back against the drywall. From a distance, they looked asleep. Naomi didn't need to get closer to see the dark pooling shadows spreading on the linoleum beneath their chairs. "Your men," Naomi breathed, pushing the door open wider. Briggs swore under his breath, raising his weapon. He moved past her, his training kicking in, slicing the pie around the corner. Naomi didn't look at the dead agents as she stepped into the hall. She was already scanning the rooms. Room 312's glass door was slit shut. The privacy blinds were drawn. Naomi moved fast. She didn't draw a gun. She didn't have one.
Instead, as she passed a crash cart in the hallway, she grabbed a heavy, solid steel oxygen cylinder from its bracket. It weighed a dozen pounds, cold, unforgiving. Briggs reached for the handle of 312. "Wait," Naomi hissed, but Briggs was already sliding the door open, leading with the barrel of his Sig Sauer. The room was pitch black, illuminated only by the pulsing green lines of the life support machines. Cole lay on the bed, a massive grid of tubes taped to his chest. Beside the bed stood a man in green surgical scrubs. He wasn't checking an IV, he was plunging a massive syringe full of clear liquid, likely potassium chloride, untraceable and lethal, directly into Cole's central line. "Federal agents, drop it!" Briggs roared. The man in scrubs didn't flinch. He didn't drop the syringe. With terrifying speed, he spun, dipping under Briggs' line of sight, and fired 2 silent shots from a weapon hidden beneath a clipboard. "Thip! Thip!" Briggs grunted, stumbling backward into the doorframe, a bloom of red erupting on his shoulder. "Hayes!" shouted, raising his gun, but the assassin was already moving, closing the distance to the doorway to trap them in the fatal funnel. Naomi didn't shout. She didn't freeze. As the assassin stepped into the doorway, perfectly framing himself to execute Hayes, Naomi swung the oxygen cylinder with every ounce of raw, unpolished kinetic force in her body. She didn't aim for the head. It was too small a target. She aimed for the center of mass. The heavy steel tank connected with the assassin's ribcage with a sickening, wet crunch. The man was thrown sideways into the hallway wall, his weapon clattering across the slick linoleum. But he didn't stay down. The professionals never did. He rebounded off the drywall, spitting blood, his eyes locking onto Naomi with dead, shark-like calculation. He lunged at her, pulling a fixed-blade combat knife from his waistband. Naomi dropped the heavy tank, it was too slow for close-quarter scrappling, and stepped into his guard, a desperately dangerous move. She caught his knife wrist with her left hand, digging her thumb viciously into the median nerve, and drove her right elbow upward, smashing into his throat. It wasn't a clean cinematic fight. It was an ugly, desperate brawl in a sterile hallway.
They crashed into the crash cart, sending defibrillator paddles, plastic-wrapped syringes, and sterile gauze scattering across the floor. The assassin was stronger, his bulk pressing her down, the point of the blade trembling inches from her collarbone. Naomi smelled the stale tobacco on his breath. She felt the hot spray of his saliva on her cheek. Her boots slipped on the loose medical supplies. "I am not dying in a hospital hallway," she thought. "Not again." She abandoned her grip on his wrist, letting the knife plunge down. As it descended, she twisted her torso violently to the side. The blade tore through the fabric of her scrub top, slicing a shallow, burning line across her ribs. Ignoring the searing pain, Naomi used the momentum to sweep his leg. They went down together in a tangled heap of limbs. She landed on top. Before he could retract the blade, she grabbed the heavy plastic casing of the defibrillator unit that had fallen beside them.
She didn't turn it on, she just lifted it by the handle and brought it down like an anvil onto the bridge of his nose. The bone shattered. The man went entirely limp, his eyes rolling back in his skull. Naomi sat on his chest for a long, agonizing second, her chest heaving.
The adrenaline peaked and immediately began to crash, leaving behind a violently cold sweat. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely uncurl her fingers from the defibrillator handle. She rolled off him, gasping for air, her back hitting the hallway wall. "Jesus Christ," Hayes whispered, lowering his gun. He was staring at her wide-eyed, ignoring Briggs, who was bleeding against the doorframe. Naomi spat a wad of copper-tasting saliva onto the floor. She pressed her hand to her side. It was bleeding, but it wasn't deep, just enough to ruin the shirt. She slowly forced herself to stand, her knees protesting loudly. She looked down at the assassin, then over at Briggs. "Told ya," Naomi panted, her voice cracking. "Standard agent's dead." The ICU room was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. Naomi stood over Cole's bed. She checked the central line, confirming the assassin hadn't managed to push the lethal dose of potassium. The SEAL was deeply unconscious, his skin pale against the stark white sheets, oblivious to the fact that he had almost died twice in the span of 4 hours. She adjusted his blanket. It was a stupid domestic gesture, completely at odds with the blood soaking into her own shirt. "He's stable," Naomi said without turning around. Behind her, Briggs was sitting on a rolling stool, letting Hayes tightly pack gauze into the through-and-through bullet hole in his shoulder. Briggs winced, but his eyes never left Naomi. "You broke that man's facial structure into puzzle pieces," Briggs said, his voice tight with pain, "with a piece of medical equipment." "He had a knife," Naomi replied, walking over to the sink. She turned on the tap, letting the lukewarm water wash over her bloody hands. The water turned pink, swirling down the stainless steel drain. "I improvised." "You don't improvise that kind of violence, Mr. Harding," Briggs said. "That muscle memory. The way you cleared the line of fire, the way you manipulated his wrist. You didn't learn that handing out juice boxes in the pediatric ward." Naomi shut the water off. She grabbed a rough brown paper towel, drying her hands meticulously. She stared at her own reflection in the cheap mirror above the sink. The dark circles under her eyes looked like bruises. The fake name, the fake life, the quiet apartment with the dying houseplants, it was all gone. 5 years of pretending to be soft, wiped out in a single night.
"You ran my prints," Naomi said, turning to face them. "You know there's a file. You just don't have the clearance to read it." "I can make some calls," Briggs threatened mildly. "I can get the clearance." "If you make those calls," Naomi warned, leaning against the counter, "people above your pay grade are going to get very nervous. Because officially, I died in a helicopter crash in the Coronal Valley 6 years ago. They spent a lot of money burying my identity. If you start digging, they won't send agents with clipboards to stop you. They'll send people like him." She pointed a thumb towards the hallway where the unconscious assassin lay. Hayes swallowed hard, his bravado entirely stripped away. "So what do we do?" Briggs asked. He wasn't interrogating her anymore. He was asking for direction. He recognized the hierarchy of the room had fundamentally shifted. "You clean up your mess," Naomi said. "You lock down this floor. You get a real tactical detail on Mitchell. And when your director asks what happened tonight, you tell him the assassin was neutralized by your partner, Hayes." "And you?" Briggs asked. Naomi walked over to her wet jacket, discarded by the door. She picked it up, fishing her plastic hospital ID badge from the pocket. The smiling, innocent face of Naomi Harding looked back at her. She snapped the plastic in half and dropped it into the biohazard bin. "Naomi Harding went home after her shift," she said flatly. She packed a bag, and she left no forwarding address. She was just a civilian who got spooked by the feds. "You can't just vanish," Hayes said. "We have your face. We have the diner footage." "Watch me," Naomi said. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't check on the SEAL one last time. The emotional detachment was already sliding back into place. A heavy, suffocating armor she had prayed she would never have to wear again. She walked out of the room, stepping carefully over the assassin in the hallway, and headed for the stairs. 15 minutes later, she pushed through the heavy glass doors of the hospital lobby. The rain had slowed to a miserable, freezing drizzle. The sky above the city was beginning to turn a bruised charcoal gray, the miserable prequel to dawn. Her side throbbed, her knuckles ached. She had less than $1,000 hidden in a coffee can in her apartment, and she knew she had exactly 3 hours to clear out before the Alphabet Agency started realizing a ghost had walked through their crime scene. Naomi pulled her collar up against the wet wind, tasting the bitter metallic tang of blood and adrenaline on her tongue. The peaceful, boring life she had built was ashes. She was stepping back into the dark. She took a breath of the cold, exhaust-choked city air, shoved her hands deep into her pockets, and disappeared into the rain. Did Naomi's brutal, calculated survival instincts leave you breathless? Some pasts refuse to stay buried, and leaving the shadows often means fighting your way back out. If you loved this gritty, adrenaline-fueled story of hidden identities and tactical combat, smash that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who loves a fiercely capable protagonist who doesn't pull her punches. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss our next intense original.